today there's a tension even within the fisher community. On one hand, there is a section of the community who wants to protect their rights to livelihood and their shared resources. On the other hand, there's another section of the community who's demanding individual property rights over the commons.
Many people have talked to us to say that, the land doesn't belong to us, we belong to the land. There was that sort of a relationship.
How do you get collective action in an urban space going, given how stratified cities, towns, etc. are?
And again, a reserve forest is a protected area which excludes other communities and uses. And the Adivasi Padas and their common lands were left out of this protection or reservation.
The idea of forests, rivers, lakes, trees, farmlands are all associated with a very rural imagination, something that's very far away from our cities, towns. But actually, in every city, you see a very diverse set of physical resources. Many cities have rivers flowing through them. Many cities have a neighborhood hiking place people go to, your everyday park where you may have concerts in, your favorite wetland or lake where you may go bird watching to. All of this actually is part of urban commons. It's also important to understand that the city actually is structured not just to include middle class and urban elites. The city actually has spaces where functional livelihoods of farming, fishing, all that feeds the city is very much part of. It's important to understand all of this with respect to urban commons, because each one of us, no matter how much, which strata we belong to, need to come together to protect these spaces and our shared values about it. Hi, I'm Kanchi Kohli, a researcher and educator. In this episode on Urban Commons, we have two great speakers. Shweta Wagh, thank you for being here. You're an urban conservationist and involved in lots of work on academic and policy work on commons. Thank you for being here. Swati Janu, founder of Social Design Collaborative, an architect, done a lot of work on spatial design and justice and housing rights. Thank you both of you for being here. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Let me just start with just asking both of you a very broad general question about when did this word commons land up in your vocabulary? When did you encounter the word commons first? And what was your reaction? How has it changed the way you think or not? Just your reactions. Either one of you can start.
I think for me, the word commons was introduced as an academic concept, as an academic word during my master's, I think, or maybe before that. But I found it maybe too obscure a concept. So I remember actually looking at some YouTube videos to really break it down and to really understand, because it's actually a very simple concept. But I think the way it's made out to be, perhaps, and I mean, I'm sure there are reasons for that, but can sometimes be difficult to understand. So yeah, that was my first initiation. And of course, over the years, finding my own sort of relationship with it, understanding it through the work that we do on ground, that understanding has developed further.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think I may have heard of the term before, but I think when I really think I heard it the first time was from the fisher community. So I had gone to Juhu Moragaon fishing village. It's on Juhu Beach in Mumbai. And there was a part of the beach, a slightly elevated rocky area where they used to dry their fish and park their boats. And that part of the beach had been enclosed, and some residents who lived in a bungalow plot adjoining the beach had fenced it up, and they also planted it with a lawn and coconut trees, and the fisher community had an issue with that. So the first time I heard about the commons was from the fisher community, and this was probably one of the articulate members from the community who could communicate in English. He was a part of the NFF and the state level organization.
NFF as in?
The National Fish Workers Forum.
Yeah.
And it was, however, what I've come to realize is that in the fisher community, although they don't articulate it as the commons, very often in their description of the places that they use for various activities related to fishing, the concept of the commons is ingrained. There are often other kinds of terms that they use, like, we hear Paramparik Zaga or Varas Zamini, Khadyacha Zamini. So you hear words in the local or vernacular language and, which are actually about the commons. And it was then that I started reading up and looking more seriously at the academic literature related to the commons. But it was first articulated by the people from the fisher community.
So, the words that you use, the vernacular words, what would they translate to?
So Khadyacha Zamini is fish drying areas.
Okay.
Varas Zamini, it's a particular form of land tenure in Worli fishing village, which has historically been there. So Varas is actually also
Intergenerational?
Yeah, intergenerational. So basically it probably refers to that.
Correct.
Or Paramparik and Samohik Zaga is about traditional community lands.
So commons is something that has almost like, when you think about it, has a rural bias, right? People think about it in terms of far away places, rural areas, etc. But yet, from your work that you've done around commons and so many other spatial design work that you've done, commons is as much in the urban areas. But how do you actually visualize the commons in an urban space? What does it look like? What does it feel like?
Yeah, that's right. That the term commons or the concept of the commons originated in the rural context, and it's generally been used to refer to the shared use of resources by rural communities, resources connected to their livelihoods, etc. And now the word is being increasingly used in the urban context, and one has increasingly started speaking of the urban commons. However, I feel when the term has been used in the urban context, very often there's some amount of vagueness or ambiguity in the sense of how it is used in terms of what is the original conception. And that, I think, is a little conceptual clarity is required in terms of how the commons are described in the city. However, my work is largely related to pre-urban settlements in Bombay, pre-urban settlements and livelihood areas in Bombay. So these were settlements which still continue in the city, and some of these pre-urban livelihoods still continue in the city. And therefore, the terms I referred to in terms of traditional or paramparik and samohik. So many of these older systems of, land, customary land use still continues in the city of Bombay.
So that is it okay to then say, to imagine that the city has grown to engulf commons, or how would that be an interesting way to understand it, or no?
In a sense, I think the whole urban development of the city of Mumbai, in a sense, has been based on a series of enclosures, and that started during the colonial rule, when the British government wanted to, somehow establish control over land, and they tried to do that through either regulation or regulating the land or urbanizing the land, or also doing revenue surveys where these lands, which were earlier just lands which were open lands or agricultural lands very often, or used for customary uses, having very shared tenure regimes or tenure systems, these then started coming in the kind of domain of private property. So I think one could in fact say that the entire city has been established through the enclosure of the commons. And what we see as commons today are the places which still remain and have still not been completely enclosed. And one sees that even at that point, when during these enclosures, during the colonial period, there was a resistance from communities to these enclosures. And even today, when we see a second wave of enclosures post-liberalization, the resistance is still there, and one sees all kinds of struggles around these enclosures, even in a context like Bombay.
Quite interesting. Is it the same in a city like Delhi or other parts you worked? And I think I just add one thing for you, Swati. Is commons the same as public lands? If in your in your thought process, if you could just
Yeah.
respond to both.
Yeah, I was thinking about what Shweta was saying, and I think maybe you're also talking about natural commons. I think where you're coming from, for example, the Yamuna and the floodplains, where we have been working for the past few years. I think the context that we work in, as we were discussing, is also slightly different. We work in informal settlements in Delhi, and I mean colloquially, many of them are called slums. The technical word is Jhuggi Jhopri cluster, the JJCs. And these are neighborhoods which are in a constant state of flux, and commons there then becomes your contested stake in the piece of land that you are on. So there is shared ownership, but it's also very like informal ownership, because your neighborhood might be on public land. And so if we are let's say building a community space together, if we are building a school or a daycare center, which is a type of social commons, a type of I think it's a form of commons as well, like parks, community spaces. And there it's a constant process of soft negotiations within the community, because the land belongs to everyone and no one. So for example, in one of the cases, we were trying to build an Anganwadi, which is a daycare center, and people were like, you can build it here because there's a lot of open space and people also children play here. And someone was like, no, I wash my utensils here, to yahan pe pani gate them. And someone said, no, this open space is actually for shadis, for weddings. And so what is that? You reach a middle ground where everyone knows okay, we want a daycare center for our children, but at the same time, it's a trade-off between maybe not enough space for weddings, or someone, maybe washes their utensils or clothes elsewhere. And so, I mean, this is one form of negotiation. Of course, there's a bigger, harder negotiation with the government, with the police, the beat constable on ground, but also at a policy level. So I think the idea of commons that I have understood in the way we work is this sort of shifting, landscape of land tenure, informal ownership, and which is shared.
So, I mean, I think both of you actually have brought out something very prominent. I think one is so much about that physical resource, but it's also, commons is so much more also about that shared use. That shared use could be where there is tenure, and the shared use could be on public land, which may not be very clear tenure, which could be owned by government or other. So I think that's a very important element, and I think to visualize that in urban areas would be also very critical. Yeah, you want to add to something?
Yeah, I would like to, for example, in terms of defining the commons in the urban commons, I think if you take an example of the beach, and I think you asked Swati the question about, is the commons, can it be the same as public land, and is there a distinction between the two? So here I would like to argue that, there is a clear distinction between the commons and public land, although both are important, not to say that one is more significant than the other. Like, we have public lands and public goods in the city, and even those are very critical in the sense from the perspective of urban life. But one needs to distinguish between what the commons are and what public land is. So for instance, if you take the example of a beach, the beach is clearly public land, or it's a public, asset. And a part of the beach, however, may be being used as a commons by the fisher community. And that's the part of the beach where usually in front of the fishing villages where they park their boats, or they dry fish, or they use it for storage or other uses. And they're also allowed to build some kind of temporary structures there. However, the ownership of the land may be public, but it's the use that makes it the common. And there might be another part of the beach which is actually private, in the sense that if a residential society or someone encloses a part of the beach or converts a part of the beach into a private beach for private use, that becomes private. So what I would like to say is these three things: the public property, common property, and private property are three distinct kind of social relations. And when I say that the commons is a social relation, or clearly a property relation, it is necessarily the relationship that people have with a resource or a place or a thing. It's how how people relate to each other vis-a-vis with reference to that resource or thing. And I think that this distinction needs to be made, because while public goods or public property can have universal claims, the commons do have certain kinds of exclusive claims made by specific communities who we can define as commoners. There's also another way that the commons has been defined is in terms of the action or the practice of commoning. It's not simply as tenure. And I think in this case, again, it's important to understand that there are three aspects which become important. One is the idea of collective labor. The second is the idea of the resource itself. And the third is the institution of management. So although there are different places in the city which, may be ambiguous, there has to clearly be some form of institution or governance, not necessarily a traditional institution, but some form of community institution which governs it.
Correct. No, I think it'll be good to come back to the commoning thing in a little more detail, I think, as we go along. So much of the conversation has been also around land, and both your work in urban areas has a element of land and water interface. Like, land becomes water, water becomes land, whether it's the coastal front or it's floodplains. Do these social relations change from what you see in other parts of the city which were much more landlocked, where this interface is not there as much? Or is it the same?
So I would like to, in this case, I would like to bring up, and there's a interesting anecdote in Bombay especially, because very often earlier when I started work with the Fisher community in, I think, 2010, the focus was largely also on the land commons, because we were trying to get them, the Fisher community was trying to get them demarcated in the development plan and acknowledged in development plans in the city. And that's how my work began. However, much later, when the reclamation for the coastal road began, that is when the first time I visited Worli fishing village, where which was going to be impacted by the coastal road, what we realized is that it was not just the land, but it was the intertidal and marine commons, which largely stood to be affected by the reclamation. When for the first time I stepped into a fishing boat with the artisanal fishers and we went out into the sea, we realized that it was largely their intertidal commons. And at this time, even the fishing community was not aware that these intertidal commons are going to be affected by the reclamation activity.
From what I understand is that so much of the land underwater or the area underwater may not have any records, tenurial records, etc. And because of which it can just get lost when new infrastructure projects or what we talk about is land use change in urban areas comes up. But those are very critical to the social relations of the people who may be on land, living on land, because they're using those spaces much more. And going back to your earlier point about the shared use of those spaces, which doesn't get visualized very much.
No, I'll try to take this one step further in saying also that it's not just social relations. They have very specific ways in which different parts of the intertidal shore and the subtidal areas are used, and this is what we try to document, because in some cases, even in the sea, they have individual or tenure rights granted to certain families in the village. So the sudge are used for casting bag nets, and these are literally demarcations in the sea. And there are also certain areas where fishing happens, different kinds of fishing happens based on the terrain, the, geomorphology or the social, the ecology of the coast, and also in terms of what specific conditions the coast has. So it's quite complex in that sense, in the way the sea or the foreshore and these shallow waters are really used by the fisher community.
Correct. And I think both of you in some senses have actually also written about these things. I've read your papers and even the articles that you've written, Swati. I think in one of your articles in 2021 you spoke about how urban plans have started now to bring out the ecological side of commons. They've also tried to make sure that people who don't have a direct stake, of occupational or livelihood or just existential stake on commons, on the, say the Yamuna floodplains, they are being actually visualized to say, okay, when you're creating recreational areas, joggers, parks, etc., so that bringing people who have been disconnected from nature back to through the commons, that connection is happening. But what is getting invisibilized, and I think that article comes out very clearly, are people who are actually dependent on the floodplains, just like you were talking about as well. So, I mean, I don't know, while you're responding to that and build on that article, also talk a little bit about how you've gone about dealing with that, in your work.
Yeah, so I think what we are all talking about here is who has a claim to the commons, or who has, ownership, because even though it's shared ownership, is only shared by a few, or at least recognized, their claim is recognized and some people's isn't. We have been working with the farmers along the river Yamuna, who have been farming there since independence. There was a farmers cooperative which was formed by the DDA. DDA is Delhi Development Authority. At that point, it was known as the DIT, Delhi Improvement Trust. And so they were given 5-year leases. So they were paying to farm there. And after a few decades, in the 90s, what happened is the DTA decided to, stop farming on the floodplains because world-class aspirations. And I think previously the emphasis in the previous master plans was on food security, which is a great idea. But then it shifted towards perhaps building, parks and towards a more gentrified approach to the floodplains. But the farmers cooperative kept collecting rent for many, many years. And even after the farmers cooperative stopped collecting rent, middlemen stepped in. And, this is how informality, takes place, because, it's not overnight. And the farmers have continued paying rent. It's just that first it was, to the farmers cooperative, then it was someone else, to landlord farmers. And over time, they have come to be seen as encroachers because according to the latest riverfront development plan, what is envisioned along the floodplains are cycling tracks, jogging tracks, and biodiversity parks. And so what has been forgotten in this process, because the farmers have been facing continuous evictions over the past years, is that's because whose claim hasn't been identified, hasn't been recognized to the river, are the farmers and the fisher folks and the cattle herders. And I think this is, yes, definitely the sort of blurry boundary between water and land is maybe one reason. But the bigger reason is also how we look at, informal livelihoods, how we look at, land title as well. I think the concept of land titling also came in with the British before that. I may be romanticizing a bit, but, many people have talked to also say that, the land doesn't belong to us, we belong to the land. There was that sort of a relationship. And so over time, when these, practices change, the people who are left out are the ones who have been most intimately linked to the nature. And not only are they dependent on it, I think also contributing. They are contributing to the city in terms of food security. When COVID lockdown happened and the state borders were sealed and food couldn't get in, it was only in the areas, along the Yamuna that people had access to fresh produce.
Correct.
And I think that's something we forget.
Shweta, in one of your papers, you basically talk about how the demand for individual rights actually is affecting commons in urban areas. Would you like to tell us some more about that paper? What does it say and its relevance?
Yeah, sure. I think with over time, like today, there's a tension even within the fisher community. On one hand, there is a section of the community who wants to protect their rights to livelihood and their shared resources. On the other hand, there's another section of the community who's demanding individual property rights over the commons. And this tension is actually, the root of this tension is clearly the transformation of the social relation vis-a-vis land, in terms of how the occupation itself has transformed. So some of the people in the fisher community are no longer fishing. And when they stop fishing, this also changes their perception and their relation to the commons. They begin to relate to it with it in another way. And then there is this move to monetize the land or to, privatize the land or to kind of develop it, and therefore also demand individual property rights to that, because they look at it as a kind of a monetary asset, valued more in terms of its exchange value as opposed to its use value, because they're no longer practicing their livelihoods.
So that's very interesting. So there is a growth of demand for individual rights from outside the community of commons, but internally also there is that this conflict that is there.
Yes, definitely. So it's like, so on one hand, the commons are threatened by development pressures, infrastructure projects, even environmentalism, which kind of wants to kind of enclose the commons and convert them into public space. On the other hand, there are also pressures from within the community, and that section of the community is no longer practicing the occupation, is now wanting to kind of monetize the land. And therefore one sees this kind of conflict within the community between fishers who are no longer fishing and the commoners who are still commoning. And very often this tension also remains because it's usually the community of ethnic fishers or the Kolis who want individual property rights because they have moved away from fishing. And sometimes there may also be instances of migrant communities who are now practicing fishing and who are the commoners. And I think one also has, one can also reflect on what can be done about this, or, is there any way to resolve this? Because one can't romanticize the commons, and relations around the commons are also changing. However, I think it's important to first, remain with the conceptual clarity about what the commons are, because the commons are essentially related to the practice of commoning and not necessarily any particular caste group or ethnic group and their right to that particular asset or that piece of land. And if it's the livelihood or that occupation which is requisite for that practice to be termed as commoning, once people move away from that livelihood, then the commons no longer exist, or that claim, they can no longer, they'll have to rescind that claim to the commons. And I think these are also some of the tensions that we will have to grapple with.
What strikes me also with the urban commons is that increasingly there is this, maybe it was always there, but whether it's through COVID or air pollution or heat waves, climate consciousness, all of that, there's a rising environmental consciousness in cities. And there is a push to create enclosures of those kinds as well. So while there are enclosures which are more private sort of enclosures for real estate, etc. But there's also a push to create environmental enclosures. How do you see that interaction with? Because it's like almost like a good and a good, supposedly interacting with each other. Are there any tensions for urban commons, or do you think it's seemingly smooth? Just your reflections. We don't have to go deeper beyond, but just your reflections, having worked so intensely with people of the commons, people who actually embody commons, what would you say?
I think different groups take different claims to commons for sure. I think the question perhaps is whose voices are heard and, whose concerns are represented the most. And in this, when it comes to commons for, let's say, for example, if there is a public park or trees are being felled because of a development project, often I've seen a lot of public outcry for environmental projects which affect, let's say, more privileged groups of people who hold more power and influence. And the term that comes to mind is bourgeois environmentalism by Amitabh Bhaviskar, which is a well-known academic concept of environmentalism, only for a few, and whose concerns are represented. And I think on the other side, when it comes to the claim staked by people like fisher folks or farmers along the river Yamuna that I was talking about, I think those are claims that are not seen as legitimate. And perhaps these are the different layers, contested layers that exist when it comes to how we view our relationship with the commons. And I mean, I'm really happy when people, gather for protest against felling of trees. I think that's really important. And I'm not saying that doesn't need to happen, but I wish the same sort of sentiment or the same sort of concern was also felt across, different groups. And I think the problem really, or I think the reason why it doesn't happen for everyone is because of class and caste bias that we have towards people such as farmers who are seen as poor, who are seen as encroachers. And I think those are the kind of conversations we need to have more to change our approach to that.
Yeah.
So I think, so there are two things. One is related to the coast. So one does see this instance of environmentalism where people, the middle class especially, also conceives of the coast as this clean and, sanitized space with clean beaches, etc. And very often fishing activity is also not just messy in terms of how it is organized, but it may also be smelly, right? And it's also that many of the residents who live on the coast find the smell of drying fish undesirable.
Yeah, even though you might eat it, but the smell is the problem.
Yes, the drying fish especially, it has a very strong smell. And again, there's an anecdote here where, there is Chimbai Koriwada, which is in the western suburb of Bandra. And once a very famous Bollywood actor had bought a house in the Koriwada facing the beach. So the land in front of the Koriwada land and intertidal commons are used by the fisher community to park their boats. They have their, society office. They have different kinds of activities going on there. And so this actor tried to enclose a part of the commons, which was being used by the fishers, and he wanted to make his private garden there. And so it almost got also into this physical fight or conflict, and it ended up his bodyguards burnt a few of the fishing boats that were lying there. So that had become an issue. On the other hand, so this was an instance where that land was being somebody tried to enclose that land and make it private property. But on the other hand, there has also been a proposal for several years now to make a promenade along that stretch of beach. So you have the Carter Road promenade in the north, which is used by the Bandra residents, and then you have Bandstand towards the south. And so this stretch of Chimbai beach is just, it doesn't have a promenade. It just has rocks, and a part of it is a sandy shore, and, it's a little messy. And they've been trying to build that promenade there for decades, but it has not somehow materialized because the fisher community is also resisting it, so it's so one sees these instances of environmentalism where in order to make something clean and pristine, or in a sense to beautify it, there are all these interventions that are proposed on common lands, and therefore these kinds of actions are very much in conflict with what the fisher community wants. And I would also like to draw attention here to another example, and I have also, to some extent, RA colony, which is a milk colony. It is in the buffer zone of Sanjay Gandhi National Park. And that again is a landscape which belong to the Dairy Development Board, and it has tabelas, buffalo sheds, Adivasi padas. There are different kinds of farmlands, community plantations, and it has got various kinds of, patches of forests or landscapes. However, when environmentalists in the city refer to RA, they refer to it as RA forest, and again, a reserve forest is a protected area which excludes other communities and uses, and the Adivasi padas and their common lands were left out of this protection or reservation. Today, there's a master plan, a draft zonal master plan for the eco-sensitive zone, which wants to open up the remaining lands for both recreational as well as commercial uses. They want to rehabilitate the Adivasi padas and put them in apartment blocks because, and somehow they look at Adivasis, and there I can really relate to what Swati is saying in terms of these informal settlements, right? Over time, many of the settlements are mixed. It's not just the Adivasis, but even other communities who live in RA.
Correct.
Sorry, if I can just quickly add, I think something that's also emerging in our conversations is this whole move, I think, across Indian cities, towards beautification, towards, you're using the word, cleaning, sanitization. And again, going to the other, sort of neighborhoods as well. Today, pedestrianization has become synonymous with removing street vendors, for example, from the pavements. So I think this is also something that is coming up in our conversations. And I think at the end of the day, everything can be linked to colonization. I feel like it's the default, sort of problem, but it is there. It is in the way, we look at the idea of development, and I think then the lack of respect for more indigenous practices and communities, and seeing developed. A lot of communities we work with are, they're considered, there's a lot of class and caste bias, but the moment you start building in more indigenous materials, it's also seen as poor, right? And our policies also reflect that. If you look at Indira Awas Yojana, which is now, Prime Minister Awas Yojana Rural, and there they were saying that we will give you a subsidy if you build a pakka house. And pakka materials are, so mud is not considered pakka, and even stone is not considered pakka. So most of the materials which you use in vernacular construction are not considered pakka, so you don't get a subsidy. And so at a policy level, I'm trying to show the problem in the way we look at things is the same problem also in the biases that we have, towards people in our society, and that reflects in our development plans. And so at the end of the day, I think that's a huge narrative to also bring out. Sorry, just
no, this is great. But I was actually going to come back to the point that you, I think, mentioned briefly, and I think it would be great to also understand comments from your work on housing rights.
Right.
So one is, of course, the work that you spoke about with respect to the floodplains, but the spatial justice and housing rights, and actually, how does that really relate to commons? In fact, this almost is like a prompt to come back to you on that question, and it's quite interesting because we're talking about real estate development, which includes housing. Elite housing in cities, but there is another dimension to housing rights in cities that we are talking about. So, just to hear some more about that.
And sorry, just finishing that thread, because I'm really enjoying this conversation, and I think so many parallel threads are running. So I think also when I'm talking about beautification and a sort of sanitization of spaces, of commons, and I think even public space, is a very important commons to talk about. Yeah. And there, I think assertion of like street vendors' rights to those public spaces, I think the same issue you see in every way, be it natural commons, be it public space, and then now coming to housing rights. As most of us would know, that most of our cities are built by the people themselves. There is not enough affordable housing, so people build their own housing. This is what we call informal neighborhoods, and they're of different kinds. I think in Mumbai, there are different names. There are chawls, and I think there are so many different typologies. In Delhi, we have also different kinds of informal settlements. And many of them are considered illegal because of absence of land tenure, or sometimes just absence of a clear land tenure. And but at the same time, there is need for education, there's need for health, nutrition, and communities are constantly co-creating these spaces for themselves with the help of civil society, sometimes liaising with the government, sometimes despite the government. And so that's where our work plugs in. So because I'm trained as an architect, and social design collaborative brings in people from different backgrounds like sociologists, engineers, designers. And what we try to do is build these community spaces with the people, identify which ones are needed. And over time, what we have come to realize is that building Anganwadis has become an effective way of creating a shared space, creating a community space, but also as a way of assertion of your right to be there, right to the city, as a sort of incremental way towards housing rights. Because the moment an Anganwadi can be set up in a neighborhood, which is actually a formal welfare scheme in an informal neighborhood set up by the Women and Child Department, it gives a formal address to the neighborhood. So even if it is considered, informal, or in some cases illegal, though those definitions need to be reconsidered. it helps create, like it paves the way for incremental access to other services, because you can set up a medical camp, you can set up a camp to get your IDs made, and then water, electricity, one by one, other sort of basic services and social infrastructure can start coming in. So that's what we have been focusing on, and creating this collective space as a way towards, I think the larger premise.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been great to, hear so many detailed things that you have been speaking about, and also to really understand how stratified, urban spaces are, and within that, the conflicting sort of uses for need to use commons itself. And I think from the last point that you were talking about even the kinds of commons that are emerging, the collectivizing that needs to happen. And you spoke about commoning very clearly, Shweta, even earlier. How do you get collective action in an urban space going, given how stratified, cities, towns, etc. are? People who have old stakes, new stakes, all of that. So just your thoughts on that and reflections.
Yeah. I always say this because it's true. I think collective action is the strength of our work, everything we've ever done. In this regard, I also feel lucky to be a part of the civil society movement in Delhi, which is very strong. So is Mumbai, actually. And I think having, good mentors and, peers to look up to work with in the housing rights sector. And I think one such thing that comes to mind was when we mobilized ourselves when Delhi's master plan for 2041 was being formulated, and it came out in 2021. But there were 3 years of preparation and consultations leading up to that. So about 40 civil society organizations mobilized themselves and created a campaign called Main Bhi Delhi, which stands for I Am Delhi Too, and we were a part of that as Social Design Collaborative. And in that, I think I really learned the sort of inner functionings of, how does a movement or how does a collective work. I mean, there have been other times when suddenly, we form a collective. There is, of course, I think sort of a task force, a housing rights task force, and we meet like every few weeks, or let's say, the first Thursday of every month, or, last Saturday of every month. But I think the moment there is a crisis, something comes up, then people come together to mobilize. For example, when about 48,000 households on railway land were at risk, and this was around 2021 during the COVID waves, and a lot of people came together and we created a railway Sangharsh Morcha. I think I'm forgetting the exact name now. But coming back to Main Bhi Delhi, there have been many, many learnings, and also how collectives work. And I think what I've also come to appreciate is different roles that different people play. And especially when it's an interdisciplinary collective, they're academics, they're activists, they're social workers, they're, students, they're young people who are learning the ropes, and there are people who have been doing this for decades, who are bringing in their experience. And then how can all these diverse actions come together towards a common cause? And I think this was a great experience to be a part of. And sometimes the timing is, it works, sometimes it doesn't. But I can add more later, but I think this is the way we have been working as a part of these different sort of nebulous collectives.
Yeah, and it's been easy.
Not always. I think, there are, I think I really enjoy working as a part of a group. So I think that part I deeply enjoy. I think it's not easy when what you're working towards doesn't happen. And I think still to think that this sort of resistance was very important to put together. Otherwise, I think, there are always misunderstandings. And I think, over time, all these sort of, pyar, mohabbat, all these sort of like love and, hate is a strong word, but these relationships, I think, that's the long-term sort of relationship that, the work is about. So maybe I'm only saying good things, but
no. It's good that you're seeing it positively still.
I think we really need this more and more of, this action. This sort of mobilization.
So I'm a part of a research collective. It's mainly an action research collective based in Mumbai. And so we were involved also in the campaign around the development plan for Mumbai. This was in 2012 when the the development plan of Mumbai was being revised. What one sees is there is a complete disruption of the earlier protections that were afforded to the commons in the earlier development plan. So we had categories in the plan called the no development zone, etc., which implicitly and also sometimes explicitly provided protection for some of the common lands and, areas being used by communities for their livelihoods. And there were various kinds of recommendations from the public. So one of the activities I was involved in was to organize or set up a consultation. So BMC had asked us to set up various kinds of public consultations with different groups of stakeholders. And I was personally responsible for organizing the one on Adivasi Padas, Koliwadas and the Gauthans, which are the pre-urban villages of Bombay. And that's where much of my work with these communities began. And so in the large meeting, it was interesting to get people from these different, one would say, local or pre-urban communities of Bombay together, the East Indians, the Adivasis, the Kolis, the Agris. And it was also interesting to see them articulate their demands because their understanding vis-a-vis the commons or their rights to land or housing were very different, when you compare even across these communities.
Correct.
The fisher community in the sense was very aware of their rights to the commons. In fact, there was a lot of advocacy around that through their state level and national level organizations. They had been campaigning about their rights to the commons and, the coastal regulation zone, etc. But the Adivasi Padas, etc., had not engage so much with planning documents. And probably this is also because the fisher community lives along the coast in Bombay, which is also the most, has the highest values in terms of real estate development. And so they have had a long history of struggles over protecting their commons. With the Adivasis, on the other hand, they live in the fringes of the national park in Mumbai. Many of those areas had already also been designated as the no development zone all these years. And they did not really, because of the restriction on FSI, the state is regulating the NDZ to prevent market forces from, monetizing that land. So somehow they had not felt those development pressures. So it was also interesting to see in the consultation how different communities articulated their claims. So while the fishers were more explicit in terms of their rights to commons and land, the Adivasis were speaking more in terms of their conflicts with the leopards or, the wildlife and, the snakes, etc. So it was also interesting to see how different groups had different interests, even amongst the original settlers of Mumbai. And many of the Agris had also, in a sense, moved away from salt making. Like earlier, historically in Bombay, we had various traditional occupations like toddy tapping, fishing, farming, even hunting, gathering, etc. And however, some of these occupations may have declined to some extent. And then it's also clear that when the occupation dies out or the livelihood is no longer being practiced, their interest in land or that resource, the way they relate to the commons also transforms. The East Indian community, for instance, who live in the Gauthans, they are the East Indian Christian community, they no longer practice agriculture.
Right.
And, and their tenure regimes are also more secure as compared to the Kolis and also in terms of the Adivasis. The Adivasis, vis-a-vis the Adivasis, there is no recognition of the Padas or their common lands at all. So even the tenure regimes across these different local communities in Bombay vary.
So you both have used so many, it's almost like you may have had to learn law on the go, or you thought you're doing architecture or urban planning or conservation, etc. But you have actually learned some of those laws and policies on the go as you've engaged with these processes. And so, in the urban space, there is a whole bunch of urban planning laws, right? And you've mentioned a few. Both of you have actually mentioned a few. And then there are a whole bunch of environmental laws or other kinds of land laws that impact the commoning. So both urban planning laws as well as other kinds of laws that are actually have a direct bearing on the commons. If you have to actually pick up a couple of them that really enable, and some others that actually are reductionist and do not enable the existence of commons in cities, because that actually really emphasizes the role of the state to regulate all this. There is through those laws and planning methods, the state actually has a heavy-handed role to regulate that. And so, how important are those laws? How much do they enhance commons, and C, how much do they don't? Yeah.
So,
No, please go ahead.
okay. So I have been a petitioner against the Coastal Road project myself. Like I collectively helped the fisher community file their writ petition, but I also became a petitioner at one point. And somehow doing that makes you some sort of gives you a good understanding of the law, just that experience. But the way I see it, our collective, so we work at the intersection of labor studies and ecology and law and planning, so that's how we are placed. And it's also that in order to understand the commons, one needs to have this multidisciplinary perspective where one engages with these different disciplinary fields. And I think when it comes to the law, there is a misconception that somehow I think in academia also it has been the commons have been spoken of as something which remain outside the gaze of the state, and it is important for them to do so in order to ensure their survival or subsistence or existence. But I think this is clearly not the case, or this is not
practically
how it works. In fact, it is urban communities and commoners who in fact clearly demand the recognition of the commons. It's not that they survive by dancing in and out of the state's gaze, or the state is not aware of them.
They want to be getting the gaze.
In fact, the state is aware of the commons. In fact, fisheries has modernized. There are state institutions that also govern the commons. You have the fisheries department. You also have, clearly you have urban planning laws. Some of them, were introduced in 1981, like the no development zone. And in a sense, the law was meant, the category NDZ under the MRTP Act, it was to regulate urban land use and to prevent high FSI in certain areas, to prevent market forces from, opening up those areas to real estate development. But somehow those regulatory frameworks have also, in a sense, ensured the existence of the commons, because a lot of the urban villages, the fish drying lands, the grazing areas, etc., in the city lie within these NDZs. And so although that may not have been necessarily the intention of the NDZ to protect the commons, there was a regulation in the development plan which enabled it. And in a sense, one needs to recognize this. However, I would go one step ahead and also further and say that it's not just that the state implicitly regulated the commons through these regulations, but they also recognize the commons. So if you look at the older development plan maps and you look at the category NDZ, it's clearly written on the maps NDZ, that is no development zone, except for activities ancillary to the occupation of fishing. So it is stated in the development plan that the state acknowledges that these lands are being used by the fisher community. And this clearly happened because there was a demand from the community to safeguard their occupations. So one clearly sees that there is a state recognition of some of these commons, if not all the commons. And one can also then look at another important regulation which came under the Environment Protection Act. I mean, one needs to acknowledge that, the Coastal Regulation Zone. And although its origin was by nature enthusiasts and, bureaucrats who tried to protect the scenic value of the coast, or to preserve the scenic value of the coast. It was the fishers who recognized that it is this regulation which is actually preventing destructive activities or prohibiting certain uses, and in a sense safeguarding our commons.
It's like the collective action actually drew additional value from a law that was not meant for do that. So I mean that's a very
exactly.
powerful...
And in fact, when in 2011 they tried to further dilute the notification or CRZ notification for Bombay by allowing slum redevelopment projects in coastal areas, that is CRZ2 areas. It was the fisher community through NFF, National Fish Workers Forum, that demanded that their lands, just the Kolivadas and their fish drying areas, be classified as CRZ3, a category which would protect them, ensure their protection. In fact, the CRZ notification also required that not just the fish drying areas, the common lands there, the right of ways, the village commons, but also the fishing zones be demarcated and, mapped on CZMP maps. So that has not been done yet. But all this came through a demand from the community. And in the 2019 version of the CRZ, they have, completely transformed CRZ2. And today it's almost non-existent for Bombay, because you can have development in CRZ2 areas, which is, similar to what can happen elsewhere in the city. Mm-hmm. And they're trying to do with this eco-sensitive zone draft zonal master plan for SGNP buffer and RA colony. They're trying to do a similar thing for RA.
So there is, in some senses, there is the good and bad in both, in all these laws. A lot depends on how it is collectivized and socialized in some ways to extend it. But I think your point about whether the state should have a role or should not have a role is an important one. That, to say that you don't have to sit outside the state to actually protect commons.
They do not survive outside the purview of the state. Correct. In fact, they are very much, demand the protection of the state. And the commoners try to, in fact, negotiate with the state in order to ensure their survival, rather than remaining outside.
That's a very important point. Any thoughts, Swati?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about what I'm hearing in all our conversations is such an important dynamics between, the state and governance and people and civil society action. And I think that's really, how they all act together is a very, important thread that's coming out in our conversations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any law that's your favorite, and any law that you hate?
I like working with lawyers, human rights lawyers specifically. But I think our work maybe more is more in the area of translating policies and laws sometimes, and sort of acting like a bridge between people, between diverse communities, and a very sort of a top-down planning that takes place. So I think what you were saying about the fisher folks, I think similar sort of experiences with waste picker groups, street vending groups in Delhi. But I think many times what happens is, because people don't speak the language of the plan, that they actually miss out on all the information which will affect them. And I think then maybe as architects and other professionals, we come in and perhaps act like a bridge or a link, or sort of translating these technocratic obscure documents into another language, a simple language. And then people know what they want. I think people have all the knowledge, and it's just that the information perhaps is not available to them, and then they know how to respond. But I think that's what I was thinking about, this triad, this sort of a triangle. This is so important, because otherwise all this, thinking is just happening within silos. And that is why I think our development plans are excluding people, because there is lack of participation, right? There is lack of these conversations. And I think what we are trying to do is create these spaces for these conversations.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. It's not just about how the law is framed, but how do you actually create processes and spaces for decision making. I think, even if they're not there, how do you actually get different diverse actors to actually be able to be part of those processes, which is equally important of action that the collective action or the commoning is that role can play.
Yeah.
Okay, let me just ask you guys Final question.
Really? Already?
So there's so many people out there who would be inspired by what you were just trying to say, or just engage much more with, the urban commons in general. And if we have to, there's so many aspects that we all dealt with today. But if somebody has to go and see this in action today, and to see at least 60-70% of what we really discussed today, to go and see it in action or interact with one particular individual, what would be that? Where would you ask them to go? Yeah.
Well, I'll go first because I have a very short answer.
Even I have a short answer.
I think, start with your own house, your own community. I think RWA is a really, I think controversial, group, which is the Resident Welfare Association in most Indian cities. When people are talking about clean public spaces, then it also becomes synonymous with removing street vendors, right? There are, of course, those kind of issues in, many RWAs. But at the same time, how can we engage in these conversations? At the end of the day, in your own neighborhood, what is, the first sort of commons you come across are parks, right? Our playgrounds. And there is actually a lot of mobilization. There is a lot of work that is happening all around us in every way. So how can we participate? How can we shape that? I think maybe that's one way to start. I mean, one doesn't have to go and, become a social worker, for the rights of a certain group of people. I think it all starts just right around you, in your campus, in your school, in your university, in your neighborhood. And I think specifically coming to when I'm talking about housing rights and you're talking about the Fisher folks and also commoning from that perspective. I think if you know some people whose work you like, and there's some collectives especially that you can be a part of, then I think sign up for that, show up for the meetings. I think there's always need for more people.
Any specific names?
I was talking about Maybe Delhi, though right now the group is waiting for the final master plan to come out. Like the draft came out in 2021, but the final master plan for 2041 hasn't yet come out. The draft came out in 2021. That's what I said, right? Okay, sometimes I get the dates mixed up. I think right now perhaps the group is not active, but there is a website and one can go.
There are members you
up.
Could speak to.
Yeah, there are different organizations that are listed there, and I feel like once you start talking to academics, your professors, once you start talking to some activist social workers, you find out about more such local groups. Okay. And if you sign up your time, I mean, all of this work, most of it is voluntary and pro bono, which I know is really challenging. And then you need like a side hustle. You need some way you're paying your bills, you're paying your rent. But over time, it adds up. And over time, you are able to manage through grants, through consultancies. And so then it becomes wider and wider, the work that you're doing.
That's great. Yeah.
So in Bombay, as we've already discussed, that the commons are all around us. I mean, that's not difficult to see the urban commons in action. And one just needs to take a walk and now perhaps a drive down the coast of the city to, see these different fishing villages and their common lands, and even the different kinds of practices of fishing, the boats parked, etc. The problem is that the coast is transforming at a very rapid pace. There are various kinds of mega projects, infrastructure projects, beautification projects, which actually threaten the commons and, and their survival. So I think that is one place that one could start. The other is, if you look at the fringes of Sanjay Gandhi National Park and in particular also RAML colony, we have the Adivasi Padas there who have their own practices of commonings. Apart from that, there is the dairy and there are commoning practices also in connection to that dairy. These occupations and these uses are also now slowly being transformed. With the new draft zonal master plan, I think it may not be, we might soon find that the commons have completely disappeared because everybody, the commoners have all been rehabilitated in high-rise buildings and the land has been opened up for tourism and safaris and zoos and recreation and whatnot. So I think now is the time to engage. Yeah. There are various citizens groups. There is an active campaign to stop or, for suggestions and objections to the draft zonal plan. I think the date is over, but I think there's an ongoing campaign now to prevent this from happening. And the city is also becoming more and more aware that, of the existence of the commons and, the need to ensure that they are sustained.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, both of you, for your very deep, incisive, and very specific examples. I think the illustrations were fascinating. I learned a lot. So thank you so much for being
Likewise.
here. It was a great conversation.
Yeah.
Good to be a part
Very
of
short.
this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.